the BioRevolution podcast.
Your hosts,
Louise von Stechow
and Andreas Horchler. The BioRevolution podcast, new tech, new talent, new challenges, biotech leadership in the age of AI. This is what we call the new episode, Easy. What's it all about?
Leadership in the age of AI.
Oh, okay. And we have a guest who has some experience. It's Paul von Bünau. He's been our guest before, and he's CEO of idalab in Berlin. And this is exactly where we are right now. Thanks for your hospitality, first of all, Paul.
Thank you so much. It's always great to have you here, and it's great to be back in your podcast and in my own office, of course.
Easy, we kick off always with quotes. What did you bring?
I brought two quotes, which I extracted from a leadership survey on AI. One comes from the CEO of Bayer, Bill Anderson, who says organizations and CEOs are not ready for AI as the full-fledged implications are not yet understood, which I think is some of what we're going to talk about today. And the other one is from Mariana Janik from Microsoft. She says, AI is like a new colleague. They need to be trained. You have to give them a clear work assignment and take your time with them, which I think is another part of what we're trying to talk about today. So how do we get ready for AI as biotech, as pharma, as medtech leaders? And how do we train our AIs as new colleagues to fit into the team and do useful work instead of creating busy work for everyone?
Paul, let's take quote number one, down the drain, forget about it all. Together in the first place?
To forget about AI
Yes.
completely for the best. Well, I think
in the sense of leadership I'm talking about.
In the sense of leadership. Okay, yes.
Right.
Well, okay, I think there are probably two sides to this. I mean, using AI to become a better leader would have probably been very low on my priority lists for where to apply this technology first, because leadership is very much about people, and it's very much about a context, understanding certain people's emotions and behaviors that you don't have data for. And if you have data for it, maybe you shouldn't have that data, right? So
also the EU AI Act would come for you if you had this data.
Yes.
Definitely. So, I mean, that's one part, right? Then, of course, there's always the question of what does a new technology do to organizations? And I think here leadership, of course, plays a big role, right? Because to make AI successful, people need to work together in organizations and need to be aligned around a common goal that are somehow not really reflected in the org chart. So AI goes diagonally through the org chart, and that is a big leadership challenge.
How do you do it in your own company?
Well, we, of course, are super aligned around AI from the very beginning. So we never erected all of the silos that established companies have. Like, we don't have people who create data which other people then want to use, and then everyone has direct access to the customer. But if you're looking at like a medtech or a pharma company, these things tend to be very, very much separated and all have their own cultures and diverging incentives.
I think a general question is, if you're in the shoes of a biotech leader or a pharma leader or medtech company, there is so much hype around AI and everyone is talking about it and everyone has use cases, anecdotal evidence and McKinsey forecasts of hundreds of billions of dollars per year that you somehow have to set free with AI. And then at the same time, you're looking at it and you might be wondering, what am I going to do with it? And I think there is, on the one hand, a lot of fear and hesitation in terms of data security, in terms of also the question, I mean, what's the goals of the bigger companies working with AI? And on the other hand, you have this, I think, FOMO, this fear of missing out, missing the train, not being at the right place at the right time. What do you experience in terms of decision-making there? Is it more the hesitant people or is it more the people who say we have to do something, we don't know what? Exactly.
Great question. So I think the situation has really shifted dramatically over the last 5 years. So 5 years ago, we were in a situation where everybody was so fascinated by the promise of AI. There were very few prominent failures that people weren't even asking, what should I do with it? People just came to the conclusion, oh my God, I just need to do something. I just need to show activity. And that was the time where huge AI labs were created that were very much separate from the core business, and many of these initiatives since then have failed to create the impact that people were looking for. So now people, I would say, are a lot more mature, more skeptical when they approach the topic of AI. And given the current macro situation that we're in, I think people are probably even more than before looking for the quick wins and are trying to focus very much on like near-term ROI. And while that is a good thing, and I'm sure there are a lot of like quick win efficiency gains that we can get from AI quickly, the question is, do the big wins come from many quick wins?
Because you mentioned, there's one elephant in the room that has to do with geopolitics, obviously, and the dependence on American situations and developments. There's an overall tendency of how can we define, how can we try to get a little bit more independent? Does this play out as well in the industry?
Yeah, I think looking at this question, wondering what do we need to get independent from when we look at AI?
That's a good counter question.
There is, of course, on the one hand, like the infrastructure level, right? We need the chips to train the big models, but not everybody needs to train their own model. And as it turns out, you can also train models much more efficiently. So I think that geopolitical dependence, sort of that choke point, as geopolitical wonks like to call it, I think that's probably not so important for the companies that are looking to find the area of application where AI actually generates some breakthrough. And in terms of talent, maybe Europe is now suddenly in a better position than we thought it would be a couple of weeks before, as we may be seeing like a reverse paperclip movement, scientists coming from the US. So I'm not sure how much geopolitics plays into what beyond Wall Street on Main Street companies are thinking.
I think it plays into the mindset more than the reality. I think that's one part of it, that people are just because there's so much uncertainty. And I think this is very difficult for people to navigate. Both in terms of what's happening in the United States, but also in terms of, we talked about it, I think in January, what happened with DeepSeek and then the stock market like going crazy for a couple of days. This is, something I think that for many people is very difficult to put into context. What does that mean for me if I am a mid-sized, small-sized German biotech who wants to use AI? What does that mean for me that NVIDIA can use hundreds of billions in a day? Probably doesn't mean anything, but...
Very good point. And I think this is what brings us back to the leadership question. Because leadership is all about essentially creating certainty out of uncertainty. We are in an uncertain environment. Nobody has any orientation. But as a leader, our task is to say, okay, even if there is no maybe quick win that we can get from AI within the next quarter, right? What do we need to do now to prepare for bigger wins in the future, even if the payout we don't have a direct line of sight to a payout yet? And that's fundamentally a leadership question, where we need to think also outside of established mental models, because we need new mental models to get the benefits from AI.
This is absolutely the path we've been on since the 1990s. Highly unusual to think what is going to be after in 2 weeks or in 1 quarter, what is going to be in 2029 or something, So that's really a mind shift. And I was wondering, when it comes to application of AI, where we have either the chance to, when it comes to the technology, kicking down the known can down the road even further, or if I want to take the other turn and think more innovation. And that's also a decision that's very much based on leadership, on decision making, right?
Absolutely. I think it's very easy to build a strategy for efficiency, right? We have something that already works, and that thing just needs to work faster or cheaper or better in some other way. But breaking out of that is really, really hard. And that's where communication skills come in, because you first need people to imagine how things could be like and how you could take a completely different approach here.
And I think we had this discussion kind of beforehand. I have this fear, especially about generative AI, and I think that's something that we're also experiencing, is that productivity or efficiency can also be a trap, because you sometimes have just productivity for productivity's sake, which if you have models that can quickly create a lot of content of whatever type very efficiently, But I mean, at some point it exceeds the level that humans can read or compute, can make any sense of. So what do you do with this efficiency gain that in the end only creates basically busy work? I think this is a question also for leaders, because I think really there you have some applications where I feel that you can gain a lot of efficiency using generative AI, but do we actually need it?
I could not agree more. I mean, I think what's probably difficult, and I think here we should maybe spend some time on like pinpointing what are applications that we already see that go into the direction of creativity, actual disruptive innovation, of really doing things very differently than before. What would you have in mind?
I think in general, anything that allows us to, we talked about it many times, scan the option space faster. For example, checking any combinations of, for example, molecules when it comes to drug discovery. These, I would say, are use cases where we really enhance the creativity and enhance the potential to come up with new solutions that we simply, because our minds are too limited or too slow, we could come up with a solution, but it would take us 100,000 years. I think this is one set of use cases. I think another set of use cases where we can really gain some benefits are maybe more, let's say, on the people side, where we can use AI to replace or enhance some of the things that humans currently do. I don't know if it's a very creative way of using it. It's like somewhere in between, I would say, creativity and efficiency, but using it in a way that makes the human capacity suddenly flow much more efficiently. And I'm thinking really about also these use cases, and can have a discussion about that later. But I mean, we had this funny term of the empathy assistant, having AI to navigate human emotions. And as we said, obviously, we are not allowed to put in real people data because, first of all, that's not allowed under EU regulation. Also, I think it's just very unethical to score your fellow beings with AI. But I think there are use cases, and I think we often forget, and this is something that for leaders is a key topic, how much time we lose by inefficient communication, by inefficient meetings, inefficient decision making, and having an AI helping us to navigate a decision space, for example, by putting in all the stakeholders that we might have for a certain use case and understanding what could their motives be and drafting basically a little bit like a mind map of where such a scenario might lead. I think that there is actually a lot of potential. I think it's not used that much. There are some companies that are based on more psychological, cognitive behavioral therapy backgrounds that try to go in this direction. And I think there is a lot of potential there.
Yeah, I mean, there's one example here, I think, that comes to my mind that is very concrete, and that is from drug price negotiations. Mm-hmm. So under the German AMNOG regulation, there is some kind of, like, it's almost like a court case, essentially, between the payers, so the Association of the German Health Insurance Companies, and then a new health tech developer who wants to bring a new drug on the market, where you are arguing, and both sides have witnesses with them, so key opinion leaders, and they will try to, on the one hand, really show the benefits for the patient, and on the other hand, they will try to undermine the value or say, well, yes, it does something, but only to a population that's quite small. And in this case, it can get quite difficult, in particular, when you're going into a new area, an indication that you don't really know so well, to quickly understand how would an KOL react to. That's an area where we see like AIs being specifically trained on medical guidelines and scientific populations, where you can do some fast wargaming of your argumentation strategy. And that goes beyond efficiency and could be something really new.
It's going to spit out the numbers, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I've been having this discussion about AMNOG with leadership from big pharma, obviously, and they are so furious because they feel underrepresented, underpaid, and everything that goes with it. And if you have a non-partisan negotiator at that point, wow.
Also, I have to say, like, this is really this very, and I think this is another way that AI can really enable leadership, because it can lower the skill barrier. Because I think especially AMNOG is something, I mean, you have very specialized personnel in the companies, in the bigger companies, and you have some service providers, but this is really very, very specialized knowledge that for anyone who's only adjacently knowledgeable about that, it becomes completely unintelligible very, very quickly. And it's very difficult to put in the right pieces of information if you're not very knowledgeable about it. And I think here, again, having this use case that AI can help you to increase your expertise in this field very quickly can be very helpful. I mean, the simplest example of that is, of course, learning a new language or having, you don't need like translators anymore. You can work with people from many different contexts and have live translation using large language models. But I think also for this more complex skills where you depend on the knowledge of very specialized personnel, but it would be also nice to have a chance to get to that level yourself and be on a more even conversation level with those people.
I think there's a very interesting dark flip side to these applications of AI that allows people to essentially like leapfrog into levels of seniority that are beyond the number of hours and years they've put in. Because what, for example, law firms and doctors and large software engineering organizations are asking themselves now, how do you become a senior lawyer or a senior software engineer now, when you can already, as a junior, use ChatGPT to get pretty good drafts of like even a complex contract, for example, right? Because you might with ChatGPT not get those years where you're doing all the boring work of sitting in the data room and revising the drafts endlessly that bring you close, like almost in an like metaphysical way, that bring you close to the subject matter, where you as a carpenter, you need to, as an architect, you need to have smelt the concrete and have felt the wood so that you get an intuition. And that kind of like is taken away, and it's not clear how to replace it.
But I'm not 100% sure that this has to coincide, right? I think there is the possibility that on the one hand, you learn something as a younger person, but your skill level is immediately raised by the use of AI. But that, of course, the value of experience will not be replaced by AI. And I remember we had the discussion about replacing human doctors on our last episode with large language models. And something that we predicted in this episode, which was that it will very much depend if you benchmark this model on the skill level of the doctor, is something that a recent study showed exactly that. It's on par with generalists, but specialists are a lot better. But I think getting, and especially in a leadership position where you have in a bigger organization so many different expertises that you need to align, also in project teams, for example, having a quick way to get on the generalist level, that can be quite helpful, I have to say.
Absolutely.
Before we talk about layoffs and people fearing for their jobs and all that, we need to talk about that as well, of course. But we need to address what on earth are we going to do if this junior, let's stick with the law firm, if you will, that the capacity will remain, will be there, the human capacity. What are we going to do with that? Does anybody have a good answer to that?
I think nobody has a good answer to that yet. But if we look back historically, it has never happened that a new technology has only taken jobs away without creating new jobs. We have all heard this many times, so it's in a way the most boring answer, but we are at the cusp, I think, of something new, and we don't know what these new jobs will be. They will not be the prompt engineer, the things that we've initially seen.
Yeah, and I think there is still, from what we see at the moment, at least with the current generative AI models, there is still, and this is maybe for people who have more expertise, who are in more senior positions, this is the question of critical thinking, of emotional intelligence, of having the intuition to make the right decisions, which currently the models don't seem to be able to do very well. So I think here we have a lot of capacity. The question is, will we lose the lower skill levels by doing so? And what would that do to a workplace? Could be amazing, could be very democratized and everyone working for themselves, but it could also go in a quite different direction.
Absolutely. And we could also see a world where suddenly there's a huge premium on being very convincing and impressive in the analog world beyond the digital. Yeah. And then maybe that goes counter the democratization, because where do you learn these skills? Where do you learn the habitus? Where do you learn all the secret codes?
Yeah, so that would
Not
actually,
in YouTube.
Yeah, that would bring you back to the way it was done in the 1950s, probably. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and the
Agreed,
Swiss
agreed.
boarding school, etc.
One question in general, where would you say, if I'm now decision maker and my company has not really dabbled in AI, but I have the feeling I need to do something now, and across the organization, across different use cases, how would you decide where to even start?
I think it's probably easier to say what not to do or how to start. And that is I think the first step is definitely not to look for use cases in your organization, because there will be endless use cases. There will be too many use cases. It's just distracting to then go through this innovation process and churn through 100,000 use cases, even if you prioritize them very cleverly. I think the first question you need to ask yourself is, what could this new technology mean for our organization? Really reflecting it back to what is unique about what you do, what are the cognitive work that you do that is very close to your core value creation, and how could that be made better with AI? And I think the answer to this question is, there is no general answer, right? So it will be very specific, and then at some point you will look for use cases and then prioritize them, etc. And then there's another direction, and that's more towards the quick wins, the boring efficiency gains. And I think here the answer is probably quite straightforward. So many of the areas that are already covered by software, like your accounting, your marketing, your blah, 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 there it really makes sense maybe to just reevaluate the vendors and look at, is there now a new entrant that does AI better than my Salesforce, my SAP system? And then maybe consider switching.
But exactly in this process, you will find cases of massive layoffs. I'm absolutely sure about that. And I mean, we were constantly talking about people may do other things that are of greater value for society, and you name it. And there are many thoughts around that, of course. But my question concerning leadership would be, how honest do we need to be in a process like that? I mean, many consultants know this game, going into a company and everybody in the staff knows the end game is, I'm going to lose my job.
That said, I think consulting is maybe one of the jobs that might be replaceable by AI very soon.
I think, so coming back to the question of honesty, because
Yes.
I absolutely agree with you. So there are people who have maybe worked in the accounting department for 20 years, their job will go. It is probably very hard for them to reorient themselves on the job market. We've seen the Kohleausstieg. We've seen what happened after the German reunification. A lot of biographies really took a downturn. That is true. That is real. And I think as a leader, you have to be honest. You have to be brutally honest. Not brutally. No, that's wrong. No, that's Roland Koch, right? So you have to, you have to be honest. I think the question that you need to ask yourself is, when are you being honest? Because you first need to have an answer, and you need to show a path forward for everyone in the company. I mean, given German labor laws, you are already, if your company is of a certain size, already quite restricted in terms of how fast you go when you're massively reducing positions. But for the smaller companies, I think it's very much about being completely transparent, valuing everyone, and trying to care for the people that you have as much as possible in a very individual way.
The other side of the equation is definitely that real big waves of innovation in our country, in Germany, are, if I think about cars or screws or quite a large number of hidden champions who do a little engineering thing much, much better and efficient. But this wave of innovation is in some industries 50, 70, 80 years ago. Of course, there's been other innovations. I think of the MP3 standard, for instance, Fraunhofer development that has been used by Apple later on and so forth. There are some good examples, of course, but we're still relying on very, very old industries mainly. Regulation doesn't help us too much in establishing like AI-driven innovation too much. So this is also a question of leadership lobbying towards civil society, towards politics, I guess.
Yeah, totally. And by the way, I would first of all maybe slightly contradict you here. I would say you're absolutely right that many of the companies that have become known as like hidden champion, like global technologies leaders, were probably founded 50 or even 80 years ago. But I would say many of them haven't stopped innovating and haven't stopped always being at the forefront. For example, if you look at laser technology, Trumpf lasers are now used by ASML. And that's just one high profile example that I know of, because it's kind of in the mindset, also the mindset of the leaders of these companies that are very technology driven. And so they've always pushed forward. But we are here largely talking about innovation in hardware. So that is definitely a big leadership challenge across all of these companies to also become innovative around software. Definitely. I think everybody has understood this now, but doing this takes a long time because you're also dealing with your established culture. And then if we're looking like at the broader, like macro level for Germany, the innovation ecosystem, I think the one big leadership challenge that we have is doing something with the great foundational research that we are churning out. Like our Max Planck Institute, our universities, they are excellent, but it's somehow for a German professor not cool to run a company.
Translational work. And the mindset of that, and I would say also in some way, and this is maybe really going very close to the German soul, it is not a goal that you aspire to as a young academic to have commercial success as well. It's kind of looked down at, and we need to change that.
Yeah, and I think, but this is really, I think it's not so much in the soul, it's more in the system. It's what you're being taught, that this is to be looked down upon a little bit, maybe, that it's not. I think in the United States, many of the people who have academic success also have 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know, George Church probably has 100 companies or patents and everything. But I think it's really just the culture in the academic institutions that's different. And speaking of what you mentioned before and what we discussed a couple of episodes ago, if we're very dependent, I think, when it comes to innovation in this part on the United States at the moment, and we need to find maybe a way to circumvent what's happening politically there. And if we don't want to replace this dependence by a dependence on another geographical region in Europe, I think we have to learn to be more, not only to be innovative, but also to have a bit more of an entrepreneurial mindset attached to our innovation that is not only output in papers, but that's also output in something that's more tangible.
We have definitely this huge cluster in Munich, LMU. They are just in the process of creating, it's the first time out of a German state of Bayern, a university entity moves to Baden-Württemberg, which is Heilbronn, and building a campus there.
Crazy.
And of course, this
is that allowed?
It seems to be. And of course, this is because a corporation leader, one of the few billionaires in Germany, is very interested in exactly this translational things and is establishing this campus in Heilbronn with a lot of companies, with a lot of basic research. I guess that's a pretty promising path.
In Berlin, I would say, Paul just hosted together with Nucleate a really interesting event where the panelists discussed a lot about the biotech ecosystem in Berlin. And you basically have the ingredients there, but there's something missing to make it this great recipe because we're not completely there.
When we looked at all the different things that it takes to create like a vibrant translational ecosystem, of course, very much looking at places like Boston or the Golden Triangle in the UK, the one like crucial thing that seems to be missing from Berlin is experienced leadership. So people who have run 2 or 3 companies in this much more complex biotech space before, that's much harder than doing what Rocket Internet has done, like from 2000 until 2010, like copying consumer-oriented internet models, right? Where it's really the leadership.
Do we need a kind of a business school in Adlershof?
I think these...
a business school for scientists.
Yeah, that has been tried many times, and I think with pretty limited success. I think what we could focus on now, and looking back like at geopolitics, what can we do to bring people to Berlin who have gained that experience elsewhere, and then make them stay? And then every failed biotech is definitely not a failure in terms of leadership development, because it will churn out another generation of people who will take on the next thing. But we need to keep them here.
What would you say, like from a mindset for both more experienced but also more junior biotech leaders, what would be like a key frame for mindset when it comes to AI? How would you approach it, or what would you advise?
You mean like a mental model that really helps? Okay, I think the first thing is to get away from the mental model that comes when you're taking intelligence too literally. Because it's kind of like a key defining feature of intelligence is that it can wrap around its head around anything. But that's the opposite of what AI technology can do. So don't think about AI in terms of a brain, infinitely flexible. Think about it like a toolbox where if the screwdriver is just a few millimeters off, it won't turn the screw. And understand all the different tools in your box and start from there.
Also touching leadership. Talk a little bit about your journey, because you did it. You went entrepreneurial, and I would love to hear some encouragement for people who are maybe at the university, PhD, post-PhD, and thinking about a university career, or why should they drop out?
I would start by saying I would always do it again. I would, of course, do it slightly differently. And what probably brought me there, that when I started my career, I always wanted to be an academic. Because I thought about academia like this place where you solve real problems and have real impacts, and you are together with other students in the lab until 2:00 in the morning, and you tinker with stuff and then things happen. This is just not the way it works anymore. I think it used to be like that if you were studying like in the 1960s, a little bit. It's gone now, I think. But it's also definitely not how an academic career works. And I wanted to have more of an impact. That was what brought me to start this company very naively in many different ways, definitely also on the subject of leadership. And I would say, if it's something that you feel that your heart is beating for, you just have to give it a go. And there are so many, you don't think about entrepreneurship as just shooting a ball on one goal, right? It's more finding a path. And there are so many different ways, places where you can decide left or right. So nothing can really go wrong.
Wow. Like it.
Yeah.
Quite convincing, isn't it?
I had the same idea about academia. But for me, like working in the lab, it was closer to that. In reality, I think it's a bit different for...
Now we're entering dangerous territory because I can go on a rant forever. But for me in particular, right, because I come from this like first pure maths, and then I went more into like AI methodology. The problem with AI methodology focused research is that it's very much a solution looking for a problem. So what you publish is a new method, but nobody needs that method. And what very often happens is that you find a new method that is cool because it's using either a Bayesian or non-Bayesian or sparse or non-sparse or neural network or non-neural network, right? That's all just what's currently en vogue. And then you try to find the problem afterwards. And that is just no way to live.
And this, in my opinion, translates again very well to the biotech field, where I think this technology-driven mindset, and especially also of people coming in, founding companies who have the tech backgrounds, and they say, we have a solution, let's find a problem. I think this is something that really creates this mindset clash, because you have the very experienced people from biotech who say, yeah, but we have a lot of problems, like real problems. We don't need your solutions that are solutions to problems we don't have. We want our real problems solved. So I think this is really something where it is also important to keep that in mind. I think a lot of this hype that was created initially around AI with this AI first biotechs was really around this. We have the solution to drug development, but it was really only a tiny piece of the challenge that they're addressing with this solution. And this is, of course, I think creating also disappointment with investors, with users, basically with everyone, because you're overhyping your solution and you don't find the right problem for it. That said, do you think there are cases where this solution-centered approach makes sense in biotech, where you would say, build it and they will come?
Build it and they will come. Yeah, that's kind of like, if you take that literally, it's very hard to imagine how like an unmet need arises because of some technology. And of course, also nothing that you would really want, right? Because an unmet need here is something that needs a cure. And so I don't know. But maybe, I think there's probably, if we move away a little bit more from the area where this metaphor originally comes from, that's like consumer technology, where you can create demand just by putting something out there that people then really want to have. I think there is a place for technology demos that don't solve any real problems, but that solve any real problem, but that give people a new way of thinking. For example, AlphaFold. One could say that the first, maybe the second, and maybe even the third iteration of AlphaFold didn't really create so much better protein structures, but it put the approach out there that you can tackle a problem not from first principles, so physics, chemistry, modeling, but by just trying to see patterns in the data and doing it top down. And that could be, that could be a way where you're doing something just for doing sake, and then it leads to good effects later.
And then again, I see that in so many applications, it's again a skill hurdle that's being lowered, because here again, you enable many people within the company, including, for example, leadership, who probably don't build protein structures depending on their background, but I think probably not mostly. But being able to also play with solutions gives you, of course, a completely different approach and a different mental path towards the problem that you're solving in your company. That's not so siloed, like you have the expert here and the expert here, and basically they don't understand what the other one is saying, but you kind of get a common ground to discuss. And I think here having this AI-driven solutions can actually be quite helpful.
In a nutshell, we need in Europe and especially in Germany something to, as a frame for this, to replace the auto industry, because it's not going to work anymore. Pharma in itself is pretty big. If I say the healthcare industry altogether is a lot bigger even. Do you believe that we have in the field, especially when it comes to AI, biotech, drug development, enough good leadership to have a fair amount of replacement of the value of the auto industry?
Maybe let's start by looking at what we have. Let's look at the glass half full first, and then we look at the bit of air that maybe is on top.
Good start.
So first of all, I think, in terms of what do we need for that, right? We need strong academic institutions, foundational research. I think that's definitely there, right? We have the production capacities and capabilities that are also very difficult to build up, right? We have like long decades of leadership in the chemical industry. So that is definitely there. We have all the big players either in Germany or in Switzerland. All of that is here. The one big thing that is probably missing is a new type of leadership that can bridge hardware, software, and biology, that can lead to a really lasting culture change around how to create value from all of this foundational technology. And in a way also build the types of organizations that have the right culture, that they can actually move forward fast without breaking so much.
I think I can just agree to that, because I think that's an excellent analysis. I think one thing that we are currently also struggling a little bit with in Europe is that the regulatory landscape is difficult to navigate and is not innovation friendly. Let's put it like that. And I think this is something that we really need to consider. And I agree. So I'm really in two minds about that, because I do agree that data privacy is important, that patients should be protected. On the other hand, I think it should also be possible for smaller biotech companies to develop AI solutions without going bankrupt in the process of trying to get it authorized, because that also will not work. Whenever you go to any conferences that have anything to do with patient data, you have endless discussions about that. And we need to find some sort of pragmatic solution to these challenges in Germany and in Europe, because otherwise we will have a very hard time to innovate if we develop something that's market ready, but we cannot bring it to the market because the regulatory landscape is completely blocking entry.
But I guess the disclaimer is very important, that nobody sits at this table who is completely against regulation.
No, of course not.
We're talking about accessibility for startups, for biotechs who are aiming to make it happen, and to make it happen in a way that is not full of administration roadblocks.
I think it could be very healthy if in every discussion that we have around data privacy and the risks that could come from using personal data, we also always need to consider the question of what is the danger if we don't use the data? What is the cost on the human life?
Yes, this is such an important point. Yeah, absolutely. What would you say, like, as a leader, you would do personally to inspire in your company the use of AI? Leading with example.
I think in our organization, the bar is already really quite high. We're all coming from the field, or mostly coming from the field. We're all working on AI technology. But I think it's very good that you asked the question, because, one always needs to eat one's own dog food. And I don't use AI in my work. And while it's very convenient to think that I'm not using AI because what I'm doing is so complex and needs so much experience and is so sophisticated that I cannot possibly help, that's probably not true. I think I also need to innovate and disrupt my own workflows to find new ways to integrate AI and leverage myself. And now that you're asking this is probably something, and I think could be real fun to maybe, I could imagine some kind of like workshop where we observe each other and then other people point out, hey, Paul, you could have done this by just using this and that tool. Great idea. Probably new product, right? New service.
Sure.
That we will do.
Love it. Yes. New tech, new talent, new challenges, biotech leadership in the age of AI. Many, many thanks, Paul, for this journey.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you, Easy.
Yeah, great fun as always.
And I guess we'll have a pretty decent list of links, annotations in our show notes that you can look up at
sciencetales.com.
Do we have any plans for next episode?
The future of food.
Wow.
And nutrition, which is something that we touch upon very often, where we give unqualified advice. So we now get a qualified person to discuss in more detail.
Please subscribe, comment, encourage us to cover other topics. Thank you for today.